Hello. Today we're going to think a little bit about Hebrews chapter 10, its argument, and then the warning that grows out of that argument. If you haven't watched the presentation number 12 that deals with chapter 9, stop now and go back and watch that before you watch this video. Hebrews chapter 10 carries on a theme that started in chapter 9, and that is the parabolic or revelatory nature of the Old Testament system of worship surrounding the tabernacle. This was a revelatory means whereby God was communicating something to the nation. So in chapter 10, in verse 1, we read, "The law is only a shadow of good things that are coming, not the realities themselves. For this reason, it can never by the same sacrifices repeated endlessly year after year make perfect those who draw near to worship. If it could, would they not have stopped being offered? For the worshipers would have been cleansed once for all." And with that statement, he picks up an idea, applies it to the old covenant system of worship, but he's going to carry it forward into the new covenant system of worship. And the idea is that the repetition, we've talked about this in the presentation, the ongoing need to offer these sacrifices indicated that the worshiper was never really cleansed of their sin, that they were never perfected, that there would be a need to come back. There was no once for all cleansing. Now, of course, in chapter 10, the writer now is going to point out that with Christ's sacrifice, with the inauguration of the new covenant, the sacrifice was done once for all. So in verses 1 to 4, the writer talks about the fact that the old covenant, and especially the system of worship built around the tabernacle, was not antithetical to the new covenant, but rather it was a foreshadowing of the new covenant. The old covenant communicated things to the people that would, in a sense, prepare them to see the reality, even though it wasn't the reality. And of course, it's pretty obvious how it did that. It clearly established the need for vicarious sacrifice, that there must be entrance by blood, as we saw in chapter 9. But it also created a thirst, an awareness of the individual worshiper's need. That this repetition, this endless repetition, would create a hunger for something that once and for all would finally put paid to sin and deal with it. Then he moves on in chapter 10 and verse 5, and he begins to talk about the alternative. The blood of bulls and goats, he says in the first 4 verses, could not take away sin. And so God did something different with Christ. And he quotes Psalm 40 to talk about this something different. In verse 4, it says, "Therefore, when Christ came into the world," what is being said here in the use of the word cosmos and the context would all seem to affirm that this is a utterance given by the pre-incarnate Son of God. As Christ came into the world, he affirmed that his role would not be to continue to offer these sacrifices that were prescribed under the old covenant, but instead, God gave him a body through which he would be able to execute and bring about the will of his Father. And so this is his testimony. "Sacrifices and offerings you do not desire, but a body you prepared for me. With burnt offerings and sin offerings you were not pleased. Then I said, here am I. It is written of me, about me in the scroll, I have come to do your will, O God." So God gave him a body so that he could offer that body as a perfect and final sacrifice for all sin. The writer of Hebrews follows the Septuagint at this point, and not the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text says, "You have dug out my ears." In other words, you have given me a submissive and listening heart, which fits the context. Many writers feel that the Septuagint uses a metonymy where the part is taken for the whole, and so it's legitimate to say, not just the ear, but a body you have prepared for me. For the writer of Hebrews, this translation, "a body you have prepared for me," as an alternative to the sacrifices of bulls and goats, makes a ton of sense. So there's the affirmation or the testimony of the Son as he comes into the world with an understanding of what he is coming to do as an alternative to these old covenant rituals. And then in verse 8, first he said, "Sacrifices and burnt offerings and sin offerings you did not desire, nor were you pleased with them, although the law required them." Then he said, "Here I am, I have come to do your will." He sets aside the first to establish the second, and by that will we have been made holy through the sacrifice of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. So now the interpretation given to this affirmation is just what I've said, that Christ was given a body so that he could offer that body, and by that one offering, it says, we have been made holy. And that is a critical statement. We are sanctified, we are set apart by that one offering. After the incarnational affirmation of the Son in 10:5-10, there is an indirect statement about the Father and his acceptance of the work of the Son. That acknowledgement is found in verse 12, where it says that he sat down at the right hand of God. Since that time, he waits for his enemies to be made his footstool, because by one sacrifice he has made perfect forever those who are being made holy. So now we see the Father is involved here. The ability of the Son to ascend and sit at the right hand of God speaks of the acceptance that the Father has for this one sacrifice. It was sufficient. And he sits there now waiting for his enemies to be made his footstool. Why? Because, and this again, this is why the Father allows him as the incarnate Son of God to sit at the right hand of God. Why he will ultimately rise up and the Father will give him possession of the earth. And he uses the word because here in verse 14. Because, all of this will happen because by one sacrifice he has made perfect forever those who are being made holy. What a profound statement. How this ought to influence our understanding of the Christian experience. What he's saying here is that in the major difference between the new covenant and the old covenant is that Christ has done everything necessary to perfect those who are God's elect, those who fall under the benefits of that covenant. That we are perfect in the eyes of God, that it is a done deal. And that because we are perfect, he is at work making us holy. Those who are being made holy, it says in verse 14. So the ongoing work of sanctification occurs because we have a standing with God established through the death of Jesus Christ. And then the third member of the Godhead comes in here. The Holy Spirit also testifies. So the Son gave his affirmation of understanding why he had come. The Father accepts the work of the Son and gives him the position at the right hand of the throne of God. And now the Spirit of God testifies. His testimony has to do with the realization of new covenant promise, both in terms of the perfection, the writing of the law to the heart, and in terms of forgiveness, which is really the author's interest. We are completely forgiven. The new covenant issue is there's no sacrifice for sin because forgiveness is the birthright of every Christian. It is our birthright. Now, the word conscience is used in a lot of different ways in the Bible, but here in the book of Hebrews, we saw in chapter 9, when it's used, it's talking about our self-knowledge, our self-awareness, our self-consciousness, what we believe about ourselves. This is very different from the way Romans uses it when it talks about it as a moral gauge. So don't think about that. But here, what the writer has told us is that in the old system, the conscience of the worshiper was constantly awakened to their need, that their self-knowledge, their understanding of their self was, they were not forgiven, that sin remained, and they were not perfect, and that they were not fit for the presence of God. Everything that he says now is that the new covenant communicates exactly the opposite message to the conscience of the worshiper. It says, you are forgiven. So the hope of the Christian is that in spite of our imperfections, in spite of the fact that we too still sin, just as Israelites sin, we have an agreement with God that states we have been perfected. There's a guarantee of perfection. And not only that, we have a high priest who is alive and ensuring that every provision of that agreement we have with God, that covenant, that new covenant, every provision of that covenant will be by his power, by his accomplishments, by his working, realized in our lives. because I understand that I have been perfected by the work of Christ, that I have been made holy, that sin has been done away with, that there is no more sacrifice for sin because all is forgiven. The writer says, therefore, in verse 19, since we have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and a living way opened for us through the curtain, that is his body, and since we have a great high priest over the household of God, let us draw near to God with a sincere heart and full assurance of faith. Now, it's so important to understand that we may not have that confidence. Everything depends on faith. Do we believe what God has said about the new covenant? Do we believe the promise God has made into the new covenant? Do we believe what he has said about the accomplishments of Christ, this once for all sacrifice for sin that has put paid to all sin in your life and in my life? It's gone. Do we understand that there's a placard hanging over our head as God's children that says one thing: forgiven? When you sin, that doesn't change. You're forgiven. Now this, if you don't believe that, if you don't understand what has been taught in chapters 9 and at this point in chapter 10, then the reality is you won't have confidence. That's why the writers put so much emphasis upon faith. Again, we go back to the parabolic nature, the metaphorical nature of that wilderness generation. They had tremendous promises from God. They had every reason to believe that God would keep those promises, that in spite of the threat of adversaries and enemies across the Jordan, that God would actually deal with that and God would give them that land. In spite of their own weaknesses, in spite of their own inability to fight, God would give them that land. And the only thing they needed was to believe it, and they didn't. And the same thing is true with the Christian today, and that's what our writer's driving at. So the writer is saying that as those who are beneficiaries of the new covenant, we have confidence. And that this confidence makes all the difference. And the confidence is rooted in really two things, and I read them for you already. First of all, in verses 19 and 20, the past accomplishments of Christ in his death and resurrection. This paid for our sin and opened the way into the very presence of God by removing guilt and by dealing with sin. But then the second reason we have confidence is that there's a great high priest over the household of God whose entire ministry is to fit us presently, currently in this life for the worship and service of God. So Christ is today actively at work in the lives of those who are his children, sanctifying them. Those that were perfected, he is now making holy. And he is an effective high priest. And so the writer says, because of this, we have confidence in the presence of God. And then he gives us some actions that are consistent with that confidence. If we are truly confident, here are some things we're going to do. Now, why is confidence so important? I think it's so important because most of us who've lived for any length of time know that the only thing that leads to failure is a failure to get up when you fail. It is the inability to find hope in the midst of failure that almost guarantees our destruction and our demise. But in the midst of failure, if we can find hope, if we can find confidence, if we can understand and believe, even when we fail, that Christ has made me perfect and I do have a high priest who is on my side, who is working in my life and who is going to help me get up and make progress once again, then we're going to do that. So this confidence is so important. The writer then tells the Hebrews that they need to take 3 steps that are consistent with this confidence. In other words, these are things that result from this type of confidence. Interestingly, the first one is exactly where he started in this section in chapter 4, verses 14 to 16. You remember back then he said that we have a high priest that can be touched with the feelings of our weakness because he was tempted at every point like we are. And then he says, therefore, let us come boldly to the throne of grace so that we can find mercy, what we need when we fail, and grace to help us in our time of need. So he had already laid out that action, that instruction for them. But then in chapter 5, he goes on and he teaches them who this high priest is in chapter 6. And then in chapters 7, 8, 9, he teaches them why they can have confidence in this high priest because of the covenant that he administers. And so having laid out this teaching, which is the fodder for faith, he then comes back to that very same command that he had given them earlier. In verse 19, he says, "Therefore, brothers, since we have this confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus," all of that confidence resulting from the teaching that they have now hopefully embraced and believed, this is the command: "Let us draw near to God with a sincere heart." So let us draw near to God. Let us come boldly to the throne of grace. Those are parallel ideas. And it is so interesting to see that he didn't only tell them to do that, but that he provided the teaching they would need to understand in order to develop the faith they must have to now realize they need to come into the presence of God to find what they will need to help get them through this difficult time. And he tells them to come with two qualities that should characterize their coming: a sincere heart in full assurance of faith. The very things that the wilderness generation lacked. And then he gives them another instruction, a second command. Let us hold, in verse 23, unswervingly to the hope we profess. For he who promised is faithful. He brings them back to confession. Hold on to your confession. Hold on to your view of reality and the hope that we have based on the promises of God and his revelation about what is real. And he reminds them to take a fresh grip. He's already talked about this, but now he's given them some instruction to help them believe and do it. And then the third thing that he says to them in verse 24, and let us consider how we can spur one another on to love and good works. He talks about how they need to engage each other as a community, really to help with these other two, to help them draw near and to help them hold on to their confession. So he says, consider, be in community and think about how you can provoke each other to love and good works, not to pulling away. He says, in our community, we need to be encouraging each other to believe the promise and trust the promise. Let us not give up meeting together as some have been in the habit of doing. You got to remember that this was an issue of identifying with what De Silva calls a sect. A dishonorable group, a group that was looked down on in society. And there are many Christians globally that face this problem. We don't in the West, but in many places in the world, where some of you are, there is a lot of disdain involved in identifying with the community of faith. And he says, don't give up meeting together. Why? Because this is where the encouragement will occur that you need in order to persevere and to get through this problem, which is the third thing. And let us encourage one another. And all the more as we see the day approaching. And no doubt the day is the day in which Christ will return, and the realization of all that he has promised will be finally gained by these believers. But then, after giving them such great teaching and helping them see what should flow from their lives when they embrace this teaching, he gives them a warning. And the warning is very strong in verse 26. If we, and I'm going to change the NIV translation a little bit, if we deliberately sin after we've received the knowledge of the truth, no sacrifice for sin is left. A very bold statement. But only a fearful expectation of the judgment and the raging fire that will consume the enemies of God. Wow. All right. So now he comes and it's as though he's anticipating the question, well, if the Christian is forgiven, if we have this confidence that we are perfected and that we have a high priest that is going to sanctify us and get us to our goal, then what about it when a believer sins? What's that all about? And having anticipated that, he now wants to explain it to them. Now, some of the translations give the impression that the issue here is perpetual sin, if we keep on sinning. And the word for sinning is a present active participle, and it could have that meaning, but the emphasis is on the adjective that's connected to it: deliberate, willful. It's not an issue of whether it is repetitive, it is about the volitional nature of the sin. Now, you'll notice that he says here, there remains no more sacrifice for sin. That is totally consistent with everything that he has argued up to this point. Up to this point, if you've gone through and underlined every time he says once for all, once, all through this chapter, repeatedly, he said, there's only one sacrifice for sin. So when a believer sins, there's no sacrifice. There's nothing in addition to the work of Christ that needs to be done. That's his point. That has been done. Forgiveness is forgiveness. So the issue here isn't forgiveness. That's essentially what he's saying by saying there's no more sacrifice for sin. The issue isn't whether the Christian's forgiven. The issue is what consequences will flow from that deliberate, high-handed sin of the believer. Now, I think that there's a good reason to say that he's actually addressing believers here and that he is not threatening the loss of salvation. First of all, let's think about the fact that he's addressing believers. You'll notice in chapter 10 and verse 26, he uses the first person plural pronoun. If we, the writer includes himself in that group. Is it a possibility that he would do this? You'll notice in chapter 10 and verse 27, the judgment described is to be upon his people in verse 30. So in verse 27, it says, but only a fearful expectation of judgment and of the raging fire that will consume the enemies of God. That is the nature of God's judgment. But then in verse 30, he says this. He says, for we know him who said, it is mine to avenge, I will repay. And again, the Lord will judge his people. So even though this wrath, this outpouring of wrath is that which falls on the enemies of God, and in one sense, a person is operating as an enemy of God when they are deliberately sinning against him, it doesn't mean that this is eternal hell. He's talking about God's judgment in verse 30 on his people. Now, those who are warned receive the knowledge of the truth. Look at verse 26. After we embraced, a very strong word, we embraced the knowledge of the truth. Verse 29. Those that sin are those that are sanctified. How much more severely do you think a man deserves to be punished who has trampled underfoot trampled the Son of God underfoot, who has treated as an unholy thing the blood of the covenant that sanctified him? So these people are those who have experienced the sanctifying work of the Spirit. And only believers could be guilty of the crimes that are outlined in verse 30, which is really a very graphic, metaphorical description of the nature of a believer's deliberate sin. The writer has a penchant for doing this, for creating metaphorical views of the believer's sin that help us enter into them emotionally. It doesn't mean that we're literally doing these things. It's impossible to literally do these things. But by describing a believer's sin this way, it gives us kind of the divine perspective, and it helps us enter emotionally into how terrible it is for a believer to do these things. So in verse 30, he says that, verse 29, when we sin, we trample the Son of God underfoot. Now that's very similar to what it said earlier when it said that we are crucifying afresh the Son of God. We are treating him the same way those who crucified him treated him. And then it says, who treated as an unholy thing the blood of the covenant that sanctified him. Now this is something that we can relate to, because in the Corinthians, the blood of the covenant, when people take communion and they memorialize the blood of the covenant, and they do it while sin is reigning in their lives, or is alive in their lives, reigning is the wrong word. It's when they're deliberately sinning, some of them died. They treated the blood of the covenant as an unholy thing. And that's why we're told to judge ourselves, to become very sober during that time and think through how our lives are going and make changes. Because we don't want to treat the sanctifying blood of Christ as an unholy thing. That's what we do when we sin. We treat it like sewer water, basically. It has no value. And who insult the Spirit of grace. That's the other thing. And that's a very graphic picture. The believer's life is the artistry of the Spirit. And when we sin, we insult the work of the Spirit. It's like you can just imagine a great master painting a picture, and then you walk up there and you take some paint and you just slash it over it. You've destroyed the work of the master. And that's what our sin does to our lives. The Spirit of God is trying to make something beautiful out of our lives, and we come along and we deface it when we sin. That's the picture. And so with these metaphors, the writer is trying to help us understand and appreciate the gravity of sin. But he tells us something else about this sin in this passage, not just these metaphorical descriptions, but you'll notice that he says that it's a deliberate sin. I tend to think that he's picking up on something that he started in chapter 9, where he talked about the offerings of the Old Testament were for unintentional sin. So in Leviticus 4, in verse 1's an introduction to the entire section. And it says this, "The Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites, when anyone sins unintentionally and does what is forbidden in any of the Lord's commandments," then he begins to map out what is to happen with regard to that. So in verse 13 of chapter 4, again, he talks about unintentional sin with regard to sin and guilt offerings. Verse 22, he mentions it. Chapter 5, verse 3, he mentions it. Chapter 5, verse 4, he mentions it. Chapter 5, verse 14, he mentions it. And in chapter 5, verse 17 and 18, he mentions it again. Now, some of these places, when you read the context, you might think, wow, how can that be unintentional? But the idea, unintentional might be an unfortunate word. The idea of thoughtless, rash, unthinking kind of sins. Probably the classic passage to help us appreciate what the writer in Hebrews is saying is Numbers chapter 15. So if you turn over to Numbers chapter 15 and look with me at verse 27, because there both the unintentional and the intentional sins are being discussed in the context of offerings. So he's talked a bit about offerings in chapter 15, but then he says this in verse 27. "But if just one person sins unintentionally, he must bring a year-old female goat for a sin offering. The priest is to make atonement before the Lord for the one who erred by sinning unintentionally." So it's the individual as opposed to the nation corporately. "And when atonement has been made for him, he will be forgiven. One and the same law applies to everyone who sins unintentionally, whether he is native-born Israelite or an alien. But anyone who sins defiantly, whether native-born or alien, blasphemes the Lord, and that person must be cut off from his people. Because he has despised the Lord's word and broken his commandments, that person must surely be cut off. His guilt remains." And then if you read on in chapter 15, it tells the story about someone who goes out on the Lord's day and defies the Lord's commandment. He goes out and he gathers wood on the Sabbath day. And when he's found gathering wood, he knew that it was wrong, and he's brought before the Lord and he's stoned because it was a sin of the high hand, deliberate sin. I think that's the backdrop for our writer's statement here in Hebrews chapter 10, where he says, if anyone sins deliberately, there remains no sacrifice for sin. Well, in terms of the Old Testament, there never was a sacrifice for deliberate sin, only an expectation of God's judgment. And our writer underscores that. Of course, there remains no sacrifice for sin because there was only one sacrifice for sin, once for all. So when a believer sins deliberately, the issue is not forgiveness. The issue is whether or not he or she will face the judgment of God. He will experience God's paternal judgment on his life. When a believer sins deliberately, he should expect the judgment of God. He deserves the judgment of God. She deserves the judgment of God. But because of the nature of God, there is always the opportunity to appeal, to plead for mercy. This is not the same as confession. Totally different. Confession is simply admitting that you sin. The plea is when you come to God and you say, be merciful to me. Lord, I know I've sinned. I rebelled in my heart, and I'm asking for mercy. Come to the throne of grace that you may obtain mercy. Now, we know from the scriptures, verses that I talked about in the presentation, that God is merciful to whom God will be merciful. It is always a sovereign choice on the part of God. In the Old Testament, David pled for mercy and God granted it to him. Moses pled for mercy and God did not grant it to him. So we don't know. But what our writer wants to emphasize is that when we sin deliberately, we should anticipate that God is not passive. God is not going to sit by as some sort of indifferent, passive parent. He is going to rise up and he's going to act. And so there's always the opportunity to appeal. But there is nothing automatic in the death of Christ that says the consequences of our rebellion will automatically be lifted and we will not fall under the paternal judgment of God. As a matter of fact, the greater likelihood is that we will. And that's where he's going to go in chapter 12 when he talks about the discipline of God. Having said all of that, he then goes back to their earlier days and he reminds them of the sacrifices they were willing to make. And he reminds them of why in verse 34. You sympathized with those in prison and joyfully accepted the confiscation of your property because you knew yourselves that you had better and lasting possessions. He's reminding them that there was a time in which the confession was strong in their life. It controlled their view of reality, and they're willing to suffer because they believe those things. And so he's urging them, to draw near, to hold on to their hope, to encourage one another to do these things. Because if they go into blatant sin, God will deal with that. We sometimes forget that this is part of the work of our great high priest. Our great high priest will discipline those that come to him, every child that comes to him.